The Mental Crack podcast contains information that may not be suitable for all listeners and is not recommended for everyone. Listener discretion is advised. In fact, we highly recommend it. If you have anyone under the age of 18 sitting near you, you may want to send them out of the room, but not before asking them to bring you back a cold drink, though that might be questionable behavior. So before we get started, go grab yourself a drink, settle into your easy chair, and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Mental Crack. Welcome to Mental Crack, killers, cults, and crimes with a proper drink on the side. It's a podcast where a true crime-obsessed and beer-nerdy wife and her whiskey and bourbon-loving husband talk about killers, cults, and other crimes while breaking down the psychology behind the madness.
Kad Mille Falche, thank you for coming back to us. 100,000 welcomes. We present to you Episode 2, Jane Toppan, Just One Fix. This week, we're excited to be doing an episode about the first American female serial killer, Jane Toppan, also known as Jolly Jane, the Angel of Mercy. Maybe. To start things off, and let me be truly honest with you, I've been doing research on Irish serial killers. I'm Irish American, and I wanted to be able to enjoy some stout while we recorded. Well, I found the story of Jane Toppan, born Honora Kelly, an Irish American woman who is believed to be the first American serial killer. I have therefore rationalized the need to tuck into this topic with some good Irish beverages. My choice, as you may have predicted, Guinness. The Guinness legacy began in 1755 when Arthur Guinness signed a lease for the St. James Gate Brewery in Dublin. This brewing business would be passed on from father to son for 5 successive generations. And in the 1830s, the St. James Gate became the largest brewery in Ireland during the reign of Arthur Guinness II. He began to brew a type of porter that later became the Guinness we all know and love today. Brewhouse 4, a state-of-the-art brewery at St. James Gate, officially opened in 2014. It's one of the most technologically advanced and environmentally sustainable in the world, and is also the largest stout brewery in the world. When we were in Ireland a few years back, we took the St. James Gate Guinness Brewery tour with my cousin Gavin. The place is an amazing sight. Several stories of Guinness history, artwork, advertising, things to do, things to see, a model glockenspiel. And during a portion of the tour, you're taught how to properly taste the Guinness and experience Guinness. So we were all given a 1/8 of a pint in the cutest little pint-style glass. It took all of my self-control to not pocket that glass. It might have been an international incident, but probably not. I imagine they had plenty of those glasses available.
And they were babysitting you because they had somebody at the front door and somebody at the back door to collect the glasses.
True, it was kind of Secret Service-y in a way.
Yep.
But I respect that. I do. It was good to know that the glasses were safe as well as we were safe while we were at St. James Gate. So Guinness Stout today is sold in over 150 countries around the world, and 10 million glasses are enjoyed daily throughout the world. And I'm about to enjoy a full pint right now, but before I do, let's pretend we're at a pub, and Guinness has put forth the 6-step process for the perfect pour. It begins with a sparkly, gorgeous Guinness-branded glass with that beautiful harp logo on it. And for the first part of the pour, the glass is held at a 45-degree angle from the spout. The spout is aiming at the harp, and then pulling the spout forward, the glass is filled until the liquid reaches the harp. The stout is to cascade for precisely 1 minute and 32.5 seconds. Again, this is per the folks at Guinness. The pour then continues with the glass positioned directly under the spout, and you push the tap handle away to top it off. And again, most properly, the pint should always be served with the heart facing the recipient of that smooth and delicious Guinness. But sadly, we're not in a pub right now, and it would be a bit tough attempting to record there. So instead of Walker, Lisa, Rob, Dave, or any of those awesome folks over at Trolley pouring my pint, I present to you Guinness and the Guinness widget. And here it goes into my treasured Trolley pint glass. Andy has become quite the connoisseur of Irish whiskey over the past couple years. On our trip to Ireland, my cousin Gavin and his fantastic wife, Christina, I love her so much, welcomed us into their home with our kiddo. And in this welcoming, a world of whiskey opportunities opened up for Andy. For Gavin is a supreme whiskey virtuoso.
Yeah, so I'm very thankful that the Gilson Foundation for Charitable Giving is one of our sponsors today. The Gilson Foundation was founded in County Monaghan in September of 2021 with the goal of supporting those relatives that are trying to get podcasts off the ground while drinking fine whiskey. The Gilson Foundation has shared that it's their mission to impart the wisdom of Irish whiskey, its many varieties, each with their own unique characteristics, with some expansion to enjoyment of international whiskeys. The president of the Gilson Foundation, Gavin Gilson, states, "The foundation is all for whiskey and against 98% of Scotch and ice." Thank you to the Gilson Foundation for this very generous and delicious gift. Today I'm drinking 18-year-old Jameson. Thank you. I am really looking forward to it. And it's said to have a profile including a nose of aromatic oils with a kiss of spicy toffee and wood. It is promised to be smooth drinking whiskey with complex tastes, many of which are found in a confection shop. These flavors, featuring fudge, toffee, spice, hints of wood and leather, a gentle sherry nuttiness, and vanilla. The finish is said to be long-lasting, the wood, the spice, and toffee hanging on right to the end. A little background on Irish whiskey and Jameson. First, Irish whiskey. One of the oldest varieties of the brown nectar, the other being Scotch, which is not Gavin's favorite, obviously.
Not acceptable.
Nope. But it is one of the two oldest. Whiskey rules go back to about 1880, and there are two major components of the Irish Whiskey Act of 1950. Irish whiskey needs to be distilled in the country of Ireland from a mash of malt and cereal grains. Irish pot still whiskey can only be distilled in pot stills within Ireland from a mash of cereal grains that are ordinarily grown in Ireland. Ingredients are unmalted or malted barley and cereal grains. The proof should be sitting between 80 to 120. ABV, obviously 40 to 60, because those two go hand in hand. It has to be aged at least 3 years. And it's typically served neat with what bourbon connoisseurs refer to as a branch, because if you drink bourbon, you typically ask for a bourbon and a branch if you just want a little bit of water on the side. Thank you to my papaw. It's basically a fancy way to say add water or dilute. I am not a fan of the term dilute, as it sounds negative, but the addition of a few drops of water is said to open up the complex flavors. As Gavin will tell you, ice cubes are not correct and add too much water. This whole branch thing has been proven through science, no less. Look it up. The BBC, through less reputable sources, have done write-ups on the chemical change that occurs. As for Jameson, going back to the 2 points I was going to bring up, 100 years before the rules around Irish whiskey, in 1780, John Jameson started making whiskey using my favorite method, triple pot distillation. The act of driving the proof up and then lowering it back down using water so that it sits at whiskey proof levels before aging it in specially selected oak barrels. Their family motto, Sine Matu, without fear, is apparent in some of the trials and tribulations that they have faced, starting in Dublin on Bow Street, then in 1971 moving outside of Cork to the Middleton Distillery. They have withstood stock market crashes, American prohibition, and the fickle taste of the whiskey discerning in their habit of jumping from one classification to another. Additionally, in recent years, their releases have become more bold with a wider variety of finishes being available to the general public. In addition to the spirits that the Gilson Foundation sponsorship has made sure that we have, snackies today. We're super excited. Last time we crinkled a bag and chewed some chips, but today we've got Tato. And three flavor varieties as well. We have salt and vinegar, smoky bacon, cheese, and onion, shipped straight from Tipperary. And soon to be right in my belly, you hear my wife, Jen.
This is smoky bacon. It is so fucking awesome.
And yeah, just basically these are tasty chips. And I guess to nod my head towards the Irish, tasty crisps.
Damn tasty.
With that, I'm going to go ahead and pour myself a drink, and this time I am using a branch. I know last time, I think I might have offended Gavin a little bit. He sent a message to my wife saying I could hear the ice cubes.
A whole lot of what the hell is going on over there.
It's okay to drink scotch on the rocks. Irish whiskey is a whole different ballgame, though. That one, I know from discerning individuals like Gavin, you only ever add a branch. So I'm going to go ahead and pour some Jameson 18-year. And while I do that, Jen, go ahead and feel free to move forward.
Well, thank you for that. All right. So before we totally... Hold on, we got to listen. Can't move forward when that's happening. It's such a pretty color. Amberylicious.
God bless the foundation.
We love you, Gilsonins. All right, so before we totally immerse ourselves in the true tale of Jolly Jane, let's take a moment to consider the female serial killer.
That's good, Yaki.
I'm going to regroup here in a second. Okay.
Sorry, you shouldn't use inside jokes on a podcast, but there you go.
There we go. All right. So I've got a feeling that if you're listening to the podcast out of the sheer luck of stumbling across it, well, you get to decide if it's luck or not, but you're stumbling across it when you're searching up your interest on podcast, favorite podcast provider, that you've likely got some exposure to Tato, true crime, serial murders, and the forensic profiles behind them. But this salt and vinegar, is it good?
Very.
Okay. So, but this exposure is by greater probability in reference to male serial killers. As the research literature highlights, very little information has existed about female serial killers, at least minimally in comparison to the case studies, forensic profiling, and high visibility received by their male counterparts. Female serial killers are believed to comprise less than 15% of all serial killers. That's 15. And in general, the literature notes that serial killers of the female gender tend to harbor very different motives, as well as accomplish their goals more often with less violent means. They are noted to be very effective in carrying out murders. Murder methods tend to be more covert, like poisoning their victims, for example. Of course, there are other methods that they utilize, such as stabbing, shooting, suffocating, and drowning. In their book, The Serial Killer Files, Harold Schechter and Charles Constant posit that the murder methods used by male and female serial killers are as diametrically opposed as male and female patterns of sexual behavior. They use the analogy of pornography, wherein males tend to experience greater arousal from, quote, extremely raw depictions of abrupt, anonymous, anatomically explicit sex, unquote, while women tend to prefer pornography that has, quote, at least a suggestion of emotional intimacy and leisurely romance, unquote. Whether these differences are culturally or biologically based is open for debate, but these differences are indeed very real. It should not be assumed, even with the differences stated prior, that female serial killers are less depraved than their male counterparts. The excitement felt by the female psychopath comes from, quote, a grotesque, sadistic travesty of intimacy and love, from spooning poison medicine into the mouth of a trusting patient, for example, or smothering a sleeping child in its bed, unquote. Turning a friend, family member, or dependent ever so lovingly into a corpse, from providing nurturance to aiding their death. Now, I just want to differentiate for a minute between a psychopath and a sociopath, and this is a question that as a psychologist I get with reasonable frequency. So psychopaths tend to be more manipulative, are usually seen by others as more charming, lead some sort of semblance of a normal life, and minimize risk in criminal activities. Sociopaths, by contrast, are typically more erratic and rage-prone and unable to lead as much of a normal life. Which brings us to a common category of female serial killer, the angel of death. This woman is a psychopathic nurse, a Jolly Jane, if you will. And in 2006, Fry, Volm, Graf, and Dittman completed a literature review that was published in Criminal Behavior and Mental Health. The aim of this review was to describe a clinical case based on the literature findings. So here's a brief summary of those findings from the literature review. While men are 6 or 7 times more likely to commit murder, that is not the ratio one would find regarding those homicides that occur in the domestic setting with respect to spouse killing. These types of murders are more often perpetrated by women who tend to have the common experience of a long history of abuse by their partner. And that makes sense. Women tend to be overlooked as the murdering type, as the general perception that one holds is that women are nurturing and vulnerable. The thought that a woman would be extremely violent is typically believed to be the result of significant provocation. The thing is, this is not the case when it comes to the serial murderer. A study completed by Hickey in 1986 indicated that based on American crime statistics, the female-to-male ratio for committing homicide is 1-6. The study reviewed the cases of 34 American female serial killers between the years of 1795 and 1998. Half of these women had male accomplices. The average age was 33. 6 of these women were nurses. Poisoning was the most common method of murder. Their victims were most often people that they knew. A study by Wilson and Hilton in 1998 analyzed the case of 105 female serial killers. Poisoning was, again, the most common killing method. The time between the first murder and apprehension by the law was far greater when poisoning was the MO as opposed to any other murder method. Keller and Keller in 1998 reviewed the cases of 86 Americans and noted that the victims were most commonly children, spouses, or the elderly. Also in 1998, Holmes and Holmes observed that female serial killers tend to live within the same areas where they commit their offenses. Male serial killers, by comparison, are more likely to roam. Holmes and Holmes also attempted to classify the female serial killer, developing 5 subtypes based on motives and pattern of offenses. These subtypes include comfort killer, hedonistic, visionary, power seeker, and disciple. The comfort killer, which is most commonly found subtype out there, is characterized by extrinsic motivation. So there's a secondary gain, and it's well planned. She's well planned and organized in her acts and knows her victims, selecting them according to expected gain. Black widows fall into this category. They also typically have the longest active period. Hedonistic killers, which are far more rare in the female serial killer world, are intrinsically motivated. Think as in sexually or sadistically motivated. And their victims are strangers, but may be selected based on specific characteristics. The hedonistic killer is also well planned and organized in her acts of murder. And in this case, I would say think of like Eileen Wuornos and the way that she carried out her murderous acts. The visionary killer tends to suffer from severe breaks from reality and commit spontaneous violent acts. Her murders are motivated by her psychosis, often being in response to internal stimuli, so hallucinations and or delusions. The power seeker is intrinsically motivated, typically by a desire to dominate her victim. Her murders are well planned and organized, and she typically opts for victims who are strangers, but that tend to have certain characteristics such as helplessness. She may use her offense as a means to boost her self-esteem, and this is where women in the caring profession are most often categorized, death angels. And finally, the disciple commits murders that are under the influence of a charismatic leader. So think Leslie Van Houten from the Charlie Manson family. She's intrinsically motivated by her desire to be accepted by her idol, and her victims are selected by her leader. Her killings are typically well organized and planned. Now, of course, just like their male counterparts, it's impossible to understand the female serial killer based solely on one theoretical framework. Biological, genetic, social, and psychological factors are at play, as are with the conceptualization of those who commit single homicides. But they don't fully account for the serial murder. Generally speaking, homicide is not a recidivist crime. So what drives a serial murderer to kill again and again? Is it positive reinforcement? Psychopathic traits in a childhood full of abusive experiences? Violent fantasies acted out? Displaced aggression? An interaction between several of these factors? Most likely. In his book, Fatal, The Poisonous Life of a Female Serial Killer, Harold Schechter gives us this food for thought. Recent criminological research teaches that shame and humiliation are common factors in the development of malevolent personalities. Children instilled with self-loathing, a sense that they are worthless, the lowest of the low, may grow up to be adults fueled by baleful impulses. Besides a lust for revenge, for getting back at the world that has treated them so contemptuously, they are filled with a pernicious need to prove their superiority over the rest of humankind. They are possessed, in the words of one criminal psychologist, by a demoniac compulsion, driven to show that they are people to be reckoned with, being endowed with formidable, even terrifying powers. And what power is more fearsome, more godlike, than holding a human life in your hands, of dispensing death on a whim? So with that in our brains, let's think about this as we discuss good old Jolly Jane.
As an aside, I'm just going to throw in, hopefully there hasn't been a lot of background noise. The new setup tends to pick up a lot more than the old setup did.
It makes me really self-conscious, but it's all good.
It does. But it's fun to use. So, going back to the story. So Jane Toppan, whose birth name was Hannah Kelly, was born on March 31st, 1857. Nice Tato. In Boston, Massachusetts, and she was born to Bridget and Peter Kelly, who were Irish immigrants. Sadly, Honora lost her mother to tuberculosis when she was very young. Her father, who worked as a tailor, was known to be alcoholic and eccentric. Those who knew him referred to him by his nickname, Kelly the Crack, as in crackpot. In 1863, Kelly dropped his two youngest daughters off at the Boston Female Asylum, Delilah Josephine, age 8, and of course, Honora, who was 6 at the time. The Boston Female Asylum was founded in 1799 by Hannah Stillman. It was a home for indigent female children. Once Kelly surrendered the girls, he was never to see them again. It was rumored that his insanity drove him to sew his eyelids shut, but the likelihood of this is questionable. Not least of which, I'm not sure how you see to sew your eyelids shut.
The guy was a tailor. He was probably magical with a needle and thread.
That's true. Anyway, that was the first thing I thought about, was I'm not sure how you get that done without being able to see what you're doing.
Bada bing.
Records from the Boston Female Asylum indicate that Kelly did not surrender the children, but rather the girls were rescued from a very miserable home. While in the care of the Boston Female Asylum, Honora was frequently reminded of her low status within society. She presented herself with a very jovial and kind disposition. She was also very intent on ensuring she did everything correctly, often seeking out approval and recognition from others. Honora was said to have had the Irish gift of gab, and as such had a penchant for storytelling that drew those in around her. And she would spin tall tales about her family, painting them as substantially elevated above the social status she was conditioned to feel shameful of in her surroundings. Even if she was touted as a liar, Honora would hold fast to her stories. She claimed her father had sailed around the world, settling in China for several years. Her brother was a Gettysburg hero decorated by Abe Lincoln himself. And later on, she would utilize her tale-telling to spread rumors about others, those whom she held grudges with or envied. She was also skilled at avoiding punishment by blaming others for misdeeds. While there are really no records of the girls' experiences at the Boston Female Asylum, it is known that Honora was placed as an indentured servant in the home of Anne C. Toppan within approximately 2 years of stepping through the door of the asylum. She was never adopted by the Toppan family, but she stayed on with the family for several years after her 18th birthday.
I actually want to interject something here. So she ended up staying on for 10 years after her 18th birthday. And the way it goes is when the girl reaches 18, the family gives her $50 and then gives them the opportunity to continue their time with the family. Now, mind you, despite staying on after that, which was awesome because she had such an important role in the family, when the Toppans died, she wasn't even mentioned in their will. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Honora took the name Jane as well as the family's last name. So now she is truly Jane Toppan. It was likely that her name was changed as a result of her Irish heritage being too apparent and the stigma associated with the Irish at the time. The Toppans tried to pass Jane off as an Italian girl whose parents died at sea. Jane, being of Italian heritage, would sit better with the Toppans' social circles. Of course, Jane was often reminded by Miss Toppan of her Irish roots. You can't help being Irish, but that doesn't mean you have to act like a Paddy. Her storytelling was not tolerated in the least, and she was not able to escape punishment while in the Toppan household. Every beating she endured further intensified her bitterness against the world, creating an emotional powder keg. As an aside, that quote, "You can't help being Irish," is actually a quote from the family. So that's not me.
Yeah. And to me, just kind of going outside of this, you would like to think in 2021 that, we've moved past kind of looking at people negatively based on their culture and their, I guess, what are the words?
Ethnicity.
Thank you. That's a good word. That's the one, ethnicity and their upbringings and just their roots. 1860s, we're talking about what was going on and the way Jane was treated by the family that she was providing service to. And I'm thinking back to the 1930s and beyond. My dad Irish, my mom Italian, and the Italian family just having so many preconceived notions about the Irish and then vice versa, and what that meant for, when they got married, just all the discussion, all the negativity around it. Mind you, one of the most amazing couples in the world. But, I'd like to think that we move past that. And I think even now it's so interwoven into everybody's being, as much as we try to say that we don't have those buy-ins for stereotypes, but it's still very present.
Well, and even if you look at the current times, between what's going on today, between the fully woke movement and the other pieces of that. Now, going back to Jen's family, there are characters on both sides of that grouping, and I love them all for their own idiosyncrasies, but good people.
Good people, crazy people. Explains a lot about me.
Makes them fun.
Best parties. Okay, so going back to Jane, and thank you for sitting there with us through this aside. After she left for placement in servitude, she lost contact with her sister Delia. Delia actually remained at Boston Female Asylum until about 1868, and she was placed as a servant in New York when she was 12. She later took up prostitution and died an alcoholic. Now, Jane also had another sister named Nellie, who ended up in an asylum. So separation, possible abuse, a history of substance dependence with mental illness within the family, all of these are present. Jane, however, did not appear to have any characteristics of insanity or derangement. Her sweet nature made it easy for people to welcome her into their homes to care for their loved ones. While in the service of the Toppan family, Jane developed a special relationship with Elizabeth Toppan, who was Anne's daughter, who was older than Jane. And she seemed to see, Elizabeth did, their relationship is very close. But Jane, on the other hand, was often reminded in one way or another that she remained in a servant role. Elizabeth had everything that Jane did not, and she was often quite envious of that. There has also been some mention that Jane came into the company of a warehouse worker during her teen years, to which she lost her virginity. He expressed a desire to marry her, even producing a ring during a clandestine meeting, after which Jane never heard from him again. It was indicated that Jane was prone to emotional eating, and she eventually carried 170 pounds on her slight 5'3" frame following the failed engagement. To add insult to injury, she was informed that her fiancé had gotten another woman pregnant, and that resulted in those two getting married. A complete slap in the face for a woman who was already traveling the road of self-loathing due to cultural, religious, and socioeconomic factors that she could not control.
So Jane stayed on with the Toppan family until the age of 28, when she applied and was accepted to the nursing school attached to the Cambridge Hospital. While it's understandable that she would turn this direction after her acceptance by others as a caregiver to loved ones, it's not really an ideal placement for a psychopath who had a bone to pick with the world after her upbringing, wouldn't you say?
I would. I'm eating Tato.
Yeah, it's with the new microphones. We're both eating Tato's like we're ventriloquists. We turn our heads away.
He totally looked at me and was like, "What did you say?" And I'm like, "But I got a mouthful of the goodness." Mm-hmm. That's what she said.
Anyway, prior to the development of nursing schools, patient care was performed by women who were in no way qualified to do so. For example, in New York City, the wards of the Bellevue Hospital were staffed by former inmates of Blackwell's Island Workhouse. The women were generally arrested for prostitution and drunkenness and were paroled on the condition that they would serve stints as nurses. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, they were working somewhat in the comfort industry, some of them anyway. So you can imagine that many of these women did not have a proper education, often being illiterate, and they were expected to read medication bottles and carry out doctors' handwritten orders. Doctors' orders, in case you haven't noticed, are difficult to decipher even on the best of days, even today. But with marginal or no ability to read, it can lead to a disaster.
Bum, bum, bum. Sorry.
I would hit the button, but I don't have that bank up. The training program was a 2-year commitment, which was strictly regimented. The women worked 12 to 14-hour days, 7 days a week, 50 weeks out of the year. Wages were meager. During the first month of training, the trainees were considered a probationer and were assigned to do the most menial tasks. By week 2, the trainee was also given charge of a few patients under the supervision of a head nurse. The trainee learned to give baths, treat and dress wounds and bed sores, give enemas, and dispense medication. Head nurses were beyond strict, and committing the smallest infraction could brand a trainee as a troublemaker. Once a trainee made it through her probationary period, she was required to make an additional 2-year commitment to stay in the training school for nurses as a student and to obey the rules of the school and hospital. At the end of her second year, the trainee was given a final exam by the Board of Physicians, and if she passed, she had a diploma.
I have a lot of nurses in my side as well as Andy's side of the family. And as I'm hearing that, the head nurses being beyond strict and essentially difficult to deal with it. Again, this was in the 1860s.
Nursing has come a long, long way.
It has. But those seasoned nurses, I am told, eat their young. So for all of you out there who might be listening that are going through nursing programs, just be strong. Just be strong. I admire you. I admire the nurses in my family, and I'm going to get off that soapbox. Yep. I solemnly pledge myself before God and in the presence of this assembly to pass my life in purity and to practice my profession faithfully. I will abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous, and I will not willingly take or administer any harmful drug. That is the Florence Nightingale Pledge.
Sorry, we both needed a drink. So, while this nurse training program might be off-putting to some, it's fair to say that prior to coming to nurse training school, Jane's life was no cakewalk. She had been in servitude since the age of 8, working as a full-time house servant. Grudge work was no real challenge to her. She had been doing it her entire life for the most part. And everything she did for her patients and in front of her superiors was marked by her bubbling, jolly attitude. It was here that she earned the famous nickname, Jolly Jane. But of course, she didn't charm everyone. She continued with her habits of spreading gossip about those she disliked, was exceptionally devious, and skirted the consequences of her transgressions by implicating others around her. Her slanderous rumors successfully resulted in the dismissal of 2 nursing students. Jane's true self, hidden being a bubbly facade, revealed itself in particular in maladaptive ways. In his study, The Roots of Crime, Edward Glover notes, the psychopath is outstandingly selfish, egotistical, stubborn, and deceitful, with an insatiable need for prestige. Rumors, lies, storytelling, and stealing that could not be proven, these were actions that chipped away at Jane's bonds with her peers. But she still remained in held high regard by her higher-ups within the system as well as by her patients. Again, referring to Schechter's book, Fatal, with respect to Jane's relationship with her patients, he states,
in her own perverse way, Jane reciprocated their affection. She was particularly fond of certain patients and felt so sorry to see them discharged that she would take steps to prolong their stay. Sometimes she would falsify their records, inventing symptoms that they didn't really have, or adding a few degrees of temperature to their fever charts. When that wasn't sufficient, she would administer small doses of medication that would make them feel worse. Not seriously ill, just sick enough to remain in the hospital for an extra week or so. And those were the patients that she liked.
It's not always good to be liked.
True story. All right, so Jane had those patients she despised, including the elderly. This breaks my heart. She had been heard to state on multiple occasions that, quote, there was no use in keeping old people alive, unquote. But she'd say this with a smile, so others believed it was actually a joke, but it wasn't a joke at all. During her time in nursing school, Jane murdered at least a dozen of her patients. Her murders were not haphazard or messy. Rather, they were meticulously carried out as a result of Jane being very diligent in her studies. At a time where poisons like strychnine and arsenic and the like were being used to treat medical maladies, Jane's fascination and curiosity on the subject of their use hardly seemed sus at all. And she would conduct experiments with her patients, see how close to death she could bring them, how their bodies responded to the poison, and experience immeasurable excitement in bringing them back from the brink of death. Excitement in having the power of God. During the 19th century, opium was cheap as well as legal. It was used over the counter, being as easy to procure as aspirin, and it was used to address a number of medical maladies, such as teething pain in infants, menstrual cramps, diarrhea, insomnia. Eventually, morphine, which is a derivative of opium, became widely used after the Civil War as an anesthesia and a pain-killing agent. Interestingly enough, as Schechter noted in Fatal, some doctors recommended it as a substitute for whiskey. Andy, Gavin.
No, thank you.
Good answer. Believing it to be the lesser of two evils from an addiction perspective. Morphine, it was said, quote, calms in the place of exciting the baser passions, and hence is less productive in acts of violence and crime, unquote. This statement was penned in 1889 by a physician named J.R. Black. However, in The Possession of Jolly Jane, morphine was everything Dr. Black said it was not, productive of appalling acts of violence and crime. In 1888, Jane chose to further her training, and she went to Massachusetts General Hospital. Now, it was easy for her to gain acceptance to the most respected nursing school in the nation, given the respect she had of her higher-up medical community, despite the head nurse attempting to block admission based on Jane's ethnic background. Jane passed her probationary period with flying colors and was held in such high regard by the physicians that she even filled in for one of the head nurses when they took a leave of absence. This is a woman who doesn't even have her diploma yet, and she's filling in for the head nurse. It wasn't too long before Jane was up to her old ways. So rumors swirled around among the other nurses who essentially hated her. She was seen as a self-promoting liar who would take all the credit and accolades for herself, oftentimes not doing the hard work. Falsified fever charts, petty theft, tampered medical records, the same thing she was doing back at Cambridge. And so the experiments were conducted like they were at Cambridge. Not only did Jane revel in the way that she could control the life and death of her patients, but she also got off on seeing her patients convulse as they slipped into a forever slumber. Like, got off as in found it sexually arousing. One of her patients survived and shared her account of her experience with Nurse Toppan. Her name was Mrs. Amelia Finney. Mrs. Finney was 36 years old, and she suffered from a uterine ulcer that required burning with silver nitrate, a usual treatment of that era. The evening after the procedure, Mrs. Finney was in such extreme pain in her lower body. And there you go. Enjoy that glass. And unable to sleep. So she sensed the presence of someone over her bed, and upon opening her eyes, she saw Jane. Jane stated, "There's no need for that. I have something to make you feel better. Here, drink this." And she helped assist Miss Amelia Finney up to a sitting position so that she could sip from a glass of a bitter-tasting concoction. Mrs. Finney felt a numbness immediately course through her body. Her mouth and her throat felt dry. Her eyelids felt heavy. She felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. She then felt her bed sheets being pulled back, and Nurse Toppan slipped into bed with her. Jane stroked Mrs. Finney's hair, kissed her all over her face, while whispering in her ear that everything would soon be okay. It was said that Mrs. Finney felt Jane turning up her eyelids to peer at her pupils, and that she could feel rapid, excited breathing on her face as Jane looked her over. The glass was placed in her mouth again. "Come, dear," she said, "drink a little more." Mrs. Finney tightened her lips in refusal, and Jane's efforts to take that any further were interrupted when she heard another person approaching. The next morning, Mrs. Finney was groggy. Her experience the night before seemed to be a dream. Or was it? And many years later, when Jane was exposed, Mrs. Finney realized how close of a brush with death she had had on that evening.
Yeah, that is crazy insane. And actually, there's modern TV shows, etc., that have moments that are similar to that, and I'll bring one up later. But it's amazing.
Widget.
But it's amazing how you just totally killed the mood on that point. But
or did I create a new and more exciting mood?
But it is interesting to think how close Miss Finney was to death, and just how bizarre it is that she climbed into bed with the patient to cradle her head and comfort her while she was sending her off.
Kiss her all over her face.
Yeah, that's just
fucking insane.
Troubling. Anyway, as in Cambridge, Jane was an expert at gaining the physician's trust and alienating her peers. In the summer of 1890, she left the ward without permission, and upon discovery, was immediately dismissed from the nursing program. She did not receive her license, but she still continued to work as a private nurse for some time and eventually returned to Cambridge to obtain her license. Of course, she continued in her typical behavioral patterns, and one night she attempted to kill a 19-year-old trainee, Mattie Davis. In turn, Jane administered the typical poisonous cocktail and her reactions to it were seen by a passing physician who was able to save her. Miss Davis's symptoms presentation was indeed puzzling to the doctor, but he never suspected poisoning. One other doctor on the staff, however, began to suspect something of Jane after several of his convalescing patients unexpectedly expired while in her care. He believed she was dispensing opiates and other drugs, paying no attention to the proper dosages, so he was looking at it as mistakes in carrying out her regular duties. He wasn't looking at anything nefarious. By this time, Jane's body count was estimated to be 24, and later that summer, Jane became a full-time private nurse. While it was demanding work, Jane could keep up well with private nursing. From 1892 to 1900, she was said to have been the most successful private nurse in Cambridge. She was highly recommended and highly sought after. She would spin tall tales for her patients and their families, and she got in the habit of taking small loans from her employers and not repaying her debts. The thing is, families were so grateful for her care that Jane provided their loved ones that they were willing to overlook such small things. The longer she practiced as a private nurse, the more intent on killing Jane became. Mind you, there were tens of people that were murdered in her care. We are just going to highlight a few in this, and as well as the madness that finally tipped someone off to her murderous ways. As stated before, female serial killers tend to prefer a certain level of intimacy with their victims. Inflicting harm on those who are strangers does not excite them. They take pleasure in killing those they are closer to, such as spouses, neighbors, friends, and their closest family members. Jane was known to visit her foster sister and her husband from time to time, but to Jane, Elizabeth was a poster child for advantage, wealth, social status, parental devotion, love, marriage, all of the things Jane craved but was denied during her life.
So Jane was known to vacation on Cape Cod during most summers, and in August of 1899, she invited Elizabeth to come join her. Jane rented a house in Cantonment, and Elizabeth was all too happy to join her and arrived on August 25th. Elizabeth was completely encouraged by her husband to just go take some time. So they enjoyed a picnic the next day, so on August 26th, and Elizabeth went to her room early. She was feeling rather drained, probably from the long day in the sun. But the next day, she did not respond when she was called for breakfast. Jane went to the house of her landlords to call for a physician, as her sister had taken ill. Elizabeth's husband, his name was Oramel, was sent a telegraph informing him of her condition. And when he arrived in Cantonment the very next morning, and this was on August 28th, Elizabeth was in a coma. The attending physician indicated that Elizabeth had had a stroke, and the next morning Elizabeth died, her grief-stricken husband and dry-eyed foster sister by her bedside. As Oramel gathered Elizabeth's personal effects, he noticed her pocketbook held only $5, when he had encouraged her to take $50 to Cantonment with her. Jane claimed ignorance of the missing money, saying she was not aware that there was that amount. She'd always had the $5. She also told Oramel that prior to dying, Elizabeth made a final request for Jane to be given her gold watch and chain. And just so you know, when police were later searching through her personal belongings, she had a heap of pawn shop tickets in one of her drawers. Of murdering her sister, Jane indicated that Elizabeth, quote, was really the first of my victims that I actually hated and poisoned with a vindictive purpose. So I let her die slowly with graping torture. I fixed mineral water so it would do that, and then added morphia to it. I held her in my arms and watched with delight as she gasped her life out. Unquote. Now, let's talk about the Davis family, because the Davis family legit is what got her caught. Alden Davis was the owner from which Jane rented the vacation home in Katomet, where she had murdered her foster sister. He was a leading figure in the community, and actually, in reading about him, he'd had his own kind of legal issues prior to becoming such a big member of the community. But he was a leading figure at that time, and he was married to a devout wife named Mary, and they had 2 daughters, Minnie and Genevieve. The Davis family quite enjoyed it when Jane would rent their house, as did the other folks in the area in Katomet, and they just loved having her there. But she was known to not pay her rent in full, despite getting a discounted rate, because she would assist the Davises when the family members would fall ill. And somehow they remained alive at that point. Okay. But Mary finally reached her limit when Jane owed the family $500. So Mary made a trip to Cambridge to collect the debt with plans to visit her daughter Genevieve in Boston. And this starts a series of murders that one by one wiped out the entire family. First, she poisoned Mary within 24 hours of her arrival to Cambridge, continuing the torture for a full 7 days before Mary's body finally succumbed to all of the poison. And Alden's daughter then asked Jane to remain the rest of the summer to look after their father. On several occasions, she started fires within the house. This is a good time to talk about the McDonald triad, which has very low validity in terms of just how it applies to serial murderers. But what was new, McDonald actually took the time to kind of look at what the common characteristics were of male serial killers. And there's the triad, the 3 things that he identified that, if they were occurring for a person, would predispose them more so to the potential for violence, like serial killing. The first thing was bedwetting, I think past the age of 7, enuresis past the age of 7. The second was demonstrating cruelty to animals, cruelty, torture, whatever, towards animals. And the third was fire setting. So in the literature, that's something that people jump on as far as, oh, well, here she is, part of the triad, showing up. But that bit of literature and research is out there, but validity is suspect. Not to say that those patterns might not emerge or be noted in some criminals. Go ahead, babe.
Turn down my mic. Wow, it's like a real work meeting now. Couldn't find the mute button. I've just got the song stuck in my head for Firestarter now. I apologize.
Twisted Firestarter.
Yep. Anyway. Sorry about that, gang. A quick trip to the 90s. Over the course of the weeks.
Oh, those dollar beer nights at the 5-0. Cheers to that. All right. Sorry. Having a moment.
Over the course of the weeks, Jane killed Genevieve, Alden, and finally Minnie. Each murder was occurring in closer proximity to the next. A month between Mary and Genevieve, 2 weeks between Jane and Alden, and 4 days between Alden and Minnie. And here's something sick as fuck. When Minnie was experiencing the ravaging effects of the poison, Jane woke her young child from their slumber to cuddle with them, and their mother was dying. And finally, someone became suspicious of Jane. Minnie's father-in-law, Captain Paul Gibbs.
Finally.
Yeah. I just like that he's Captain Paul Gibbs. So I feel like he just rolled in on a schooner and, like an Edward Gorey character in his captain outfit and went,
I'm having an Andy Gibb moment. and Barry Gibb moment. All I can think about is that skit on SNL with Justin Timberlake. And I'm sorry, who's the other guy?
Yeah, that wasn't him, but it's, oh no, this is horrible. You should have written this out ahead of time, then we could have gone back to it. But it's the guy who has a night show now,
He
and I'm
was
drawing
a
a blank
late
on his
night
name.
host.
Well, he is a late night host still.
I don't stay up that late.
Oh, damn it all. It'll come to me later.
If this was a YouTube video, I'd say put it in the comments below.
Well, it'll be on the Patreon page. That's what you say in a podcast. It'll be on the Patreon page.
Yeah, we'll get it out there for you guys. Jimmy Kimmel.
No.
Yes. No.
No. Jimmy Kimmel Live, because he was on, wasn't he the Ben Stein dude? Okay.
Oh, wait.
Quick.
Well, I'm looking it
Quick,
up.
back out of the rabbit hole, Jen.
No,
My head, I'm ears deep. We need to start backing up from the rabbit hole.
Who is this guy?
No, we're going to feel stupid whenever we find it out, because I can picture him, but
Jimmy Fallon.
there we go.
I don't feel smarter.
No, and you shouldn't.
I feel old. Anyway, back to the podcast already in progress.
Yeah. That was a shame.
Jimmy Fallon.
Just stop it. By the time Captain Gibbs set an investigation into motion, that's awesome. He is still an Edward Gorey character. As Captain Gibbs, as Captain Gibbs sets an investigation into motion, knowing many prominent members in the community,
Dude had connections, lots of connections.
Well, as any captain should in a small seafaring town.
Aye.
Do you mind?
Sorry.
Engines full ahead. Ding, ding. Okay. Jane was on her way back to Lowell to attempt to win the love of Elizabeth's husband. She resided with him briefly in a non-romantic arrangement, faked attempting to kill herself with poison when he demanded that she leave his home. This is probably a nightmare for him.
This woman is as cluster B as the day is long.
Yeah, I can only imagine how that conversation went. But yeah, so she is a drama queen, obviously, among other things, because he probably dodged a bullet on this one multiple ways. But in Katamet, the DA was ordering the exhumation of Genevieve and Minnie for autopsies. And then for a brief time, the world's attention was shifted to the attempted assassination and death of President McKinley. And on the day of President McKinley's assassination was executed, Jane Toppan was arrested in the case of the successive murders of the Davis family. Jane's arrest made the headlines on Halloween of 1901, which we're coming up on the anniversary of later this month. And then on the day of her arraignment, Jane's strong facade was tumbling down. Jane pleaded not guilty, and a media frenzy ensued as Jane refused to speak on her own behalf while housed in the women's wing of the jail. Many witnesses and experts were called for the defense and the prosecution. Dr. Henry Rust Stedman, a well-known Boston psychiatrist, often referred to as alienists during this period, had the opportunity to assess Jane's mental state, and the following summary is made by him, and these are his findings. The prisoner, Jane Toppan, comes of a family in which intemperance and mental weakness and disorder are prominent diseases and features. Her utter lack of moral sense has been evident from childhood, and her incorrigible proclivity to falsehood, dishonesty, and probable theft. The good moral and mental religious training which she received in her youth resulted in no modification of her character, and were practically thrown away on her in that respect. Her moral insensibility is further apparent in the absence of her sense of fear before, during, and after the commission of her crime, and of remorse, sorrow, or genuine affection of any time. This defect is even more forcibly shown by the fact that her chief victims were especial friends. Her lack of apprehension of her situation, her levity under such circumstances, and her inability to realize the enormity of her deeds are strong evidence of mental weakness. That an irresistible propensity propelled her to crimes of arson and murder is shown by the great frequency and variety of such acts and her continuance in them, regardless of consequences. There is an absence of any apparent motive for her criminal acts in some cases, and an inadequacy of motive in many of the others. This is shown in the total lack of evidence of pecuniary gain or satisfaction in revenge as a rule. Except minor thefts and transient enmity, these would be powerless with sane criminals as an incentive to habitual homicide. The prisoner's disease, history, and present mental state correspond with a well-recognized form of mental disease of moral type due to the congenital degeneration in which there may be little or not intellectual disturbance that is apparent to the ordinary observer. By the way, gang, I'm sorry, I have to stop here and say that after drinking throughout this whole thing, it's really hard to read the
really heavy shit
that
Stedman's throwing down.
Well, it's not only the really heavy shit that Stedman's throwing down, but
pecuniary.
But you jump back a century in the way people talked and try to read.
Hold on, there's other good ones in here. Enormity. Enmity.
Yeah.
Enmity. Hold on, there's plenty. Yeah, I was proclivity.
See, for Jen, who has gone to school
incorrigible
for psychology, some of these terms just roll off the tongue. For myself, not so much. Anyway, going back to the story, a completely psychopathic personality. Yes?
You're doing a great job.
Excellent.
Good job, boo.
Here, let me take a drink on that.
Yeah, you might want to, as we get ready to hear what the verdict of the jury was.
Can't be good. A completely psychopathic personality, and the verdict of the jury, coerced by the presiding judge.
Dude was like, you're going to go ahead and decide that this is what it is.
Yep. Came out to be NGRI, or not guilty by reason of insanity. And she was sentenced to live out her life under confinement in the Taunton Insane Hospital. Sorry, I thought of Taunton.
I'm not going out there. No. It's cold.
That would be the Family Guy Don Don.
Don Don.
I'm not going out there. It's too cold.
All right, I'm going to pick up here. So upon hearing her sentence, it was reported that Jane was like, big smile, laughed aloud, practically fucking clicked her heels dancing out of the courtroom. And she was sentenced to life in an asylum.
Carry on. I'm eating Tato now.
Tato. Okay, so she goes to an asylum, and it was clear her murderous tendencies never really went away. For years, nurses in the asylum would hear her calling down the halls, threatening to kill again.
Get some morphine, dearie, and we'll go out in the ward, she'd say. You and I will have a lot of fun seeing them die.
And she died at Taunton, at the age of 81. Wow.
And there you have it, the first American female serial killer. It's kind of chilling. There are some interesting pieces there that are, well, more than chilling, just a little frightening in the way that somebody could go through this in a normal lifespan and just not even bat an eye. And Jen, I know you haven't watched it yet, but there are striking similarities between Jane and a character in the fourth season of Fargo, which I do recommend. It has a lot of good actors in it, Chris Rock being among them.
I actually watched a part of an episode. His character was fantastic.
Yeah, it's not a comedic character. It's actually a drama-based character. Not to say that there's not comedy thrown in there because it's Chris Rock, but there's comedy in regular life.
I mean, sometimes, and just, I'm sorry, we're totally going off the page here on this, but, you know, as it goes, like, comedians tend to get pigeonholed, but he's actually showing his, like, diverse acting ability here. Yeah, he was amazing in this.
Yeah, he displayed some real chops in this. It's the way that he acted in this reminds me a lot of, and now we're really far off the reservation, but Steve Buscemi in Boardwalk Empire, where you have a character or a person that plays a specific type of character throughout most of their career, and then they get brought into a excuse me, they get brought into a slightly different role. And for this role for Chris Rock, he was very straightforward, very serious. Definitely worth watching. There you go, Fargo. You get a plug from me. I know it's a little bit old, but anyway,
sponsor us.
But
please. Sorry.
That being said, hopefully you guys can hear my dog yodeling outside the door. But the reason it reminds me of Fargo is there's a nurse, Oretta Mayflower, and basically she rolls through. She's played by Jessie Buckley, and she rolls through the entire series taking out elderly individuals, basically putting them out of their misery by taking a syringe and injecting. I'm not positive what it is they're injecting. I wasn't watching it that closely, but she basically takes the syringe and pushes it into the saline that's going into their system, and then basically they die. At one point she did one maliciously, but the rest were done just out of I guess trying to, well, I don't know. I think it was just enjoyment's sake, quite frankly. But she also, the other thing that struck me is that while Jolly Jane had all the pawn tickets, Oretta Mayflower had rings, watches, and they eventually get found by the Undertaker's daughter whenever she's cleaning the house.
So she had her own kind of, I know she took a lot of memories, reminders. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, what else is there to say about Jolly Jane?
I honestly don't have a lot off the top of my head, but you know there are parts of this that make me think of other TV shows like American Horror Story and some other type. It's definitely the kind of stuff that horror movies are made out of.
Oh, absolutely.
Or suspense thrillers. And it's interesting as far as the era that it occurred in because you know, everybody likes to talk about the good old days, and people tend to forget the good old days aren't actually the good old days. It's just you're looking at the halcyon side of things.
Yeah, not that good all the time.
No.
All right, well, tune in next time. We had talked to you guys in episode 1 about doing a Survivors of Jonestown episode, so we're going to do that. It should be a good time. You know how we do. And I want to go ahead and go to our list of shout-outs. As always, we are shouting at our kiddo. You might hear dogs in the background right now, flopping ears and all that good stuff.
Kiddo came in, and then the dogs decided that they were going to start attacking.
The Tato.
We have my dog, which is crazy in here, and flopping its ears. And anyway, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. We also want to thank and shout out the Gilson Foundation because we are still. Andy's killing that Jamie 18, and the Tato is just happening for real.
Yeah, it just dawned on me I'm chewing in the mic.
It's okay. It's Tato. Also want to shout out Kristen Harris and Yeet Trivia. You can find them on Facebook and on Instagram. Yeet Trivia hosts many types of virtual games, trivia games, like wrong answers only, topic-specific stuff like The Office, Friends, Schitt's Creek, Parks and Rec, Harry Potter. Did a fundraiser recently, she did, for Disney Princess Trivia. I'm hoping at some point she will do Disney Villains Trivia, because that's more my bag.
Yep.
October is full of a lot of fun games. She's running 4 games per week, I think, in October. And hey, guys, Mental Crack is sponsoring one of Yeet Trivia's events on Wednesday, October 20th, just in time for Halloween.
Unfortunately, it's the version that I do horrendously, if I'm not mistaken.
It's horror movie trivia. It's not wrong answers only.
I'm down.
Yeah, I'm going to be throwing some questions in there, though, because you can't have horror movies without having like killers that are inspiring those movies.
Yep.
And again, it's
damn it, dog.
It's going to be a good time. Of course, I just want to say that it is October, and every day 365 is Halloween, but this is the best month ever. But
it is.
It is.
It is.
It's awesome. But come join us because it's going to be a super fun time.
If you're like me, wrong answers trivia is a lot of fun to listen to the answers to, but yeah, that's kind of how I feel all the way through it, if you guys just heard my dog. But I have a really hard time shifting gears into the mental the mental arena that you need to be in to be able to do wrong answers trivia.
It's pretty debauched and messed up. I don't know that we're going to drop this in time, probably, but tomorrow, actually, October 3rd, Mental Crack is sponsoring a wrong answers only trivia. And I'm going to tell you guys, like, with this one on the 3rd and the one on the 20th, man, Mental Crack has picked some really damn fantastic prizes. So if you want to get on board with Heat Trivia, and I hope you will, tickets are available via Eventbrite. So go on, get to it, do the thing, make it happen.
In all fairness, we should be dropping this probably tomorrow morning, is my assumption. I've just got to pull it off the board.
And then it's going to take some time for you to listen to our musings on life.
Good luck with that.
Yes. So, guys, thank you for listening. This podcast here is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Breaker, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public via Anchor by Spotify. So we're going to be working on adding more platforms soon. Our cover art is by yours truly and our fantastic child, Sabine, who also provides creative consultation.
And background noise.
As well as our dogs. Thank you.
Yeah, lastly, I want to make a mention to the music used in the disclaimer. I really enjoyed making that. That was, you probably heard it, the little piano pieces, but the song Wasted Wonderland is by Mew. And it was used under the Creative Commons license. I do have some more hardware coming that will allow me to actually start doing some music production as well, but that's not here, and it's, with everything else COVID, it's delayed.
It's always the Rona.
Yep.
Every time.
But anyways, on the Patreon page, you'll find both a link to his other work and the license that's involved as far as the Creative Commons license. I guess, Jen, you can read the next one because it would be silly if I read it.
Our producer is Andy Meyer.
Yep. And email us at mentalcrack. That's mentalcrack at gmail.com. Connect with us on Instagram at mentalcrack and on Facebook, Mental Crack, the podcast. Visit our Patreon page for access to sources cited in the preparation of this case, and consider becoming a patron of the show.
Y'all, we got some really cute damn stickers that I designed that at certain Patreon support levels will get you one of those bad boys. I'm sorry, I'm just really excited about the designing. So, okay. All right, back to you, Andrew.
Nope. And again, thanks for listening to Mental Crack. We'll check you next time, and with each one, hopefully they get a little bit better. Let us know what you think, and also let us know that they're sounding better if they are. Hopefully they are.
Bye, guys. We'll miss you.
Yep. I'm going to tuck into my drink over here. You guys have a good night.
Sláinte.